So we've talked about Dürer as a great painter from northern Germany in the early 1500s, around the same time of the High Renaissance in Italy, but up in the north. But Dürer was also a great printmaker. And this is one of his prints called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse from the Revelations, Book of Revelations.
This is an excellent example to talk about Dürer's printmaking, in part because it's a woodcut. There are several different types of printmaking that are popular in the late 1400s and early 1500s, and the woodcuts was the first and most popular type of printing at the time. There's a couple of reasons for that, but maybe one of the most important ones is the way that a woodcut is made. When we're looking at a woodcut like this, what we have to keep in mind is that all of the lines that have been printed on the page were raised up off the surface of the printing block. And so we need to imagine that on the piece of wood that this was printed from, when we look at this cloud, there was a thin piece of wood standing up from the surface, and the carver, sometimes Dürer himself, had carved away everything that's white and blank. It's like a stamp, basically.
So you kind of ink the raised parts.
Right.
And then press it down
and then it gets put in the printing press where the paper gets pressed on the raised part, exactly like a stamp is how we should think of it. And since
it's like a very hard process.
It's very labor intensive, but it's worth it in the end because you can make a lot of them and they're relatively cheap, and you can make money that way, as Dürer did. You can spread your point of view that way because they can be distributed. They're very portable. And so a lot of effort goes into it at first, but then once you're making the prints, there's a lot of them. They're inexpensive. They can be carried around easily, and so they helped spread your name or your ideas very quickly. I was going to say that they were popular because they could be combined with the printed word, which is becoming printed more and more often at this time because, like letters in a typewriter, in modern times, the images are raised up off the surface like the letters, and so they could all be combined in the same printing press and used together.
And then the other kind of medium that Dürer used to make prints were engravings.
That's right. He was interested in other kinds of media too, because although he could achieve, as we can see, a great deal of light and shadow and some detail in these woodcuts, there are ultimately limitations to the woodcut process, even though Dürer was a great master, as we can see. And the primary problem is, as we've said, that you're cutting away what you don't want to print. It's not a very direct way of making a representation. You're not drawing with a pen or painting with a paintbrush.
It's the opposite.
You're making the marks that you don't want to appear on the paper, if that makes any sense. And that creates difficulties. Also, it's very hard in a woodcut to get very fine lines or very sharp details, because if you want a very thin line, like the lines in the clouds are to a certain extent, you have to imagine these are very thin fins, basically, of wood that are sticking up, and in the printing press they might crush and break, and so it's hard to get sharp. It's amazing that this print is as detailed as it is. So Dürer is interested in other methods of printing that can give him the kinds of details and tonal gradation that he might be able to find.
Yeah, this has a very kind of sharp feeling between dark and light.
Right.
And most woodcuts do have that feeling.
There's not a lot of middle grays here.
Exactly.
And so what he's able to do is then instead, later in his life, take advantage of the engraving printing technique, which is very different from the way a woodcut is made.
So how do you make an engraving?
Well, the primary difference is that with an engraving, you actually, the gestures that you make are the lines that will appear on the paper.
Like drawing.
Like painting. It's not an opposite. It's not working backwards like you are with a woodcut. With an engraving, you work with a metal plate, and you use a very sharp instrument with a V-shaped tip. It's called a burin, and you push that through the metal.
Is it hard to push through the metal?
It's not very hard because it's metal, so it's hard, but you do have this very sharp knife-like tool, and of course we have to think of the metal as being very smooth, uniform surface. Again, advantage over woodcuts, which has grain and knots and other defects. The lines that you're making with this tool can be extremely thin. You can make the very faintest of lines, the very smallest of tiny little dots on the surface. And here we can see how Dürer has been able to achieve the kind of detail and textural nuances and subtleties of shade and light that he would never, ever be able to achieve with a woodcut. There's no way this image could ever have been made with a woodcut, especially if we look at the faint lines and dots, for instance, over here.
Those reflections from the light in the window. window.
if that was wood, it would have been crushed in the
Right.
force of the printing press. And so
And
here are the
what's
advantages.
happening is the ink is going inside those incised areas in the metal plate.
You're carving the lines, then the ink goes all over the plate, including in the lines.
And
You
then you
wipe
wipe
off
it.
the surface of the plate so that the ink is only in the lines, and then you put it through a printing press that presses much harder than a woodcut printing press, and that gets the ink onto the paper, which has been dampened in order to attract it.
And by pressing hard, you probably can't pull that many prints from a single plate.
This is one of the disadvantages of engravings. There are a couple compared to woodcuts. One of them is that because of the high pressure of the printing press and the faint, very delicate dots and lines of an engraving, you can't make as many good prints from an engraving
It would
plate.
get kind of blurry.
It gets
probably.
very blurry, it gets
Ink
very low
everywhere,
contrast,
right.
it's very gray, there's no dark, deep shadows or fine definitions.
Right.
So you can print fewer engravings than you can a woodcut.
And that would make
Surprisingly.
them more expensive.
That makes them more expensive, along with the fact that the raw materials that you're using are also more expensive, metal instead of wood. And so engravings, in addition
more
to
rare,
having
right?
more detail, they're more rare, more expensive than woodcuts are. But we see that the payoff is a kind of tonal subtlety and gradation
yeah,
and
richness.
ability to achieve detail that would be completely impossible
Yeah.
in any other kind of printing technique that was available at the time.
There's something very appealing about each of these processes, but in very different
Each of them
ways.
has their advantages. It's not that one is superior to the other, but
No.
rather that they allowed artists to achieve different goals that they had.
And by the way, this is Saint Jerome in his study.
This
by
is St.
Durer.
Jerome in the Study, a later print by Durer from the early 1500s. And
It's just so lovely. The
It's a-
light coming in through the window, that looks very Northern Renaissance.
it's
to me.
amazing how he's able to achieve with an engraving the characteristic features of Northern European painting,
Yes.
like the effects of light and shadow, the sense of texture, the sense of detail, and also this idea of the solitary man in his study
Yes.
working at probably the translation of the Bible that Jerome is famous for. That sense of devotion and solitary, pensive thought is also rather
Right,
Northern.
that individual relationship with God or personal relationship with God.
Absolutely.
That was there in the
And
North.
we should also add that there are influences of Italian art here too,
Absolutely.
because it's quite evident that Durer has used one-point perspective
Yes.
in making this figure in
And
its
kind
room.
of, he makes that very obvious. He clearly wants to sort of show off his ability to create the illusion of space with linear perspective.
In the early 1500s, there were not many Northern European
No.
artists who had the mastery of perspective
Yes,
as
which he
Durer
did.
did, since he had traveled to Italy twice in the
It's a bit
1490s.
showing off here, I think.
Absolutely.